quotation that I've given as the title for this evening's talk is a quote from a particularly graphic medieval Welsh poem. But I'm going to start off, well, we are the Church Monument Society, so I'm going to start off by talking about some tombs. What I'm going to be talking about to start off with is a follow-up to Christina Welch's splendid online lecture on cadaver tombs, which was part of our last spring series. So I'm not going to cover the ground that Christina covered, but it's all available on our YouTube channel, which you can access via YouTube or through our website, churchmonumentsociety.org, and there is a button which links you to subscribe on YouTube. So I'm not going to go over the basics about cadaver tombs. If you feel you need to know more about them, Christina's lecture on the YouTube channel is the place to go. But I want to develop some of what she said. I want to look specifically at how the ideas about the macabre are worked out in medieval Wales. I want to put the Welsh examples in the context of the art of the macabre generally. And then I want to look at what the amazing resources of medieval Welsh poetry can tell us about, can add to our understanding. To a certain extent, I think I'm actually going to be contradicting things that I've said in the past. I used to think we had very little of the macabre in Wales, and that this perhaps linked to a generally more optimistic approach to death, to the fate of the soul. I don't think I was totally wrong, but preparing this lecture, I've realized that what I've said in the past needs a lot more nuance. It is more complicated. So I am going to disagree with myself. In a very small way, I am going to rewrite history. I'm a historian. That's what we do. Now, Christina in her lecture did mention a couple of Welsh cadaver monuments. This one in Llandaff Cathedral, which is a splendid piece of carving, albeit somewhat battered by time, and this one in the parish church of Tenby. These are both of them beautiful pieces of carving, professional, well-carved products. I think you would say in terms of the art of the macabre generally, they are actually perhaps rather, well, dare I say it, anodyne. There are no worms, there are no toads, there are no small creepy objects. These are just the human body in an emaciated state of decomposition. So in actual fact, in terms of the art of the macabre in Europe, that makes them really quite mild. I think they're probably both of them upper clergy. They're both tonsured. So only members of the upper clergy would have had the resources to provide themselves or to be provided with tombs of this sort. So there are those two that Christina mentioned, but there is another one further west in St Dogmael's. It's now in Cadw's Site Museum at St Dogmael's Abbey, which is near Cardigan on the west coast of Wales. It's virtually impossible to photograph because it's behind a lot of perspex. But if you look at it carefully, you can see it is an infinitely inferior piece of work. There's the upper part of the body, very, very badly and crudely carved. There's the face, virtually unrecognizable. The feet. You can quite see why you can quite see why Christina didn't include it. But actually, I think it's the crudity of the carving that is the point. Let's go back to the face. St Dogmael's was a Tyrrhensian abbey. And as far as we can see, though it's not clear because the carving is so poor, this figure does seem to have a tonsure. It's a cleric. It's presumably a member of the monastic community, probably one of the abbots. So what we've got is a cleric in remote West Wales who is aware of the fashion for cadaver tombs, but doesn't have sufficient resources to commission the sort of professional product that we've seen in Llandaff and Tenby. So he's had to go to his local jobbing stonemason that the abbey would have had, a local stonemason who did their bits and pieces of work. And he's explained to the local stonemason what what he wants. And the stonemason has said, probably in Welsh, yeah, hollol, dwi'n gallu wneud hynny. Yeah, sure, I can totally do that. And this is what he's come up with. So I think the point about this one is, and this is where I have to start arguing with myself, you see, I think the point is that awareness of the significance, awareness of the desire for this kind of macabre imagery extended to the furthest corners of Wales, and also extended to those with limited resources, limited contacts. I think that is quite an important point, and something which I should have allowed in what I've written before. Now, as well as these 3 cadaver tombs, we have got 2 other examples of fairly macabre art back in Tenby. 2 little groups of shroud effigies on the tombs of Thomas White, a merchant of Tenby, and his son, John. Now, Thomas and John White were leading merchants of Tenby. Thomas was probably involved with the young Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII's escape from Tenby, via Tenby to Brittany in 1471. He was Lancastrian, the Yorkists had won, Henry and his uncle had to flee. If we look at a little bit of detail, we can see these 3 shrouded figures in a sort of cage structure with a plaque above them with a bit of poetry on. We'll come to the poetry in a minute. And here is the detail of Thomas White's tomb. They're not identical. This has straightforward, smooth arches. This one has a little bit of tracery on it, there and there, and there, and there. So they're not identical, but they are very, very similar. Now, I've not seen anything like this anywhere else. More to the point, I have asked all the alabaster experts in the Church Monument Society. I asked Sally Badham, I asked John Bayliss, I asked Sophie Oosterwijk, who was the expert on the imagery of the macabre. And none of them had seen anything like this anywhere else. Alabaster tombs are normally produced pretty much to a pattern. So I was surprised to find something that looked as though it was a one-off, an original design, but it looks as though this one may have been. So who have we got depicted in these 3 little shrouded figures? Now, if you look at them in the context of the whole tomb, the initial assumption was that they were young children of the family. They're so small, you see, in comparison with the full-size effigy up at the top. Children of the family, infants, possibly wrapped in their chrism clothes or their swaddling clothes. Sophie Oosterwijk included them in an article on chrisms and infant memorials, while pointing out that they don't actually have the characteristic crisscross bands that you'd expect of a very young child. Sophie's article, I've put links to a lot of the resources for this talk on our blog, on our website. If you go to the website, go to publications, you get a drop-down menu, click on the blog, and you'll find it. So you get a link to Sophie's article from that. So our initial assumption was we were looking at children. But then John Bayliss spotted that actually each of the 2 tombs, the White's father and son, they were both twice married. So are these triple figures actually, is this John White with wife number 1 and wife number 2? Similarly, on his father, is this his father with 2 wives? And then again, the cage that they're in, these cage structures, they do look like the cages that you get on the big double-decker cadaver monuments, like the one to Archbishop Chichely in Canterbury Cathedral is one of the famous ones. So does that suggest that they're adults? Sally Badham pointed out that these cages are actually on sort of brackets. And Another of Sophie Oosterwijk's articles, which again I've put a link to on our blog, an article called Babes on Brackets, pointed out that when you get these figures on brasses, very often if they've got a bracket underneath them, it means they're a small child. But then again, when you look at the whole tomb, all the panels are on brackets. So again, that doesn't really get us very much further. Okay, so let's look at the poem. There are the shroud figures. There are the brackets. The poem. Very, very difficult to read. I struggled over this for a long time. It's one of these, it starts respice qui transis, reflect you who pass by. And it's one of these poems, reflect, consider man as you pass by, as you are, so once was I, as I am, so you will be, remember death will come for thee. It's a familiar poem in English on later tombstones. It's familiar in Welsh as well. Here it is in Latin in a slightly different version. Respice qui transis, magnus medius puer ansis. Let's have the translation to help us. Consider you who pass by, whether you are old, middle-aged, or young. Reflect in your mind that you will suffer such a death. Put forth prayers for me, so that thus I may have a hope of pardon. So it's quite a standard idea, asking people to reflect as they pass by and asking for prayer. Now, the first two lines, respice qui transis magnus medius puer ansis, and the last two lines, pro me funde preces quibus sig mihi sit venie space, are fairly, well, I've seen them on other tombs. I've come across them on other tombs. The middle two lines, I haven't seen anywhere else. And if anybody else has seen those lines anywhere else, please let me know, because I would love to know. Now, I did a preliminary version of this lecture at our AGM and study day in London back in September. And Moira Ackers, who was one of the people who organizes our event series, pointed out that the three little figures, let's get back to the three little figures, they do look a bit like those Romanesque carvings of the three wise men, the Magi, the three kings, sleeping and being woken by the angel and being warned that they've got to get out of the way. And images that the three kings are often represented as reflecting three ages of man. So do these three shrouded figures actually tie in with the poem? And these are the old, the middle-aged, and the young person who's being mentioned in the poem. So I said it's a familiar poem in English. We've also got, and well, there was once an early version of it on a late 13th century tombstone in Chirk Castle. Whoever you are, who passes by, stay, this watch and weep. I am what you will be. I am what you will be. You will be what I am. Pray thee, our Father, for me. It's no longer in Chirk Castle. The family was allowed to sell it. I last saw it in a London antiquarian seller's catalogue about 15 years ago. We've no idea where it is now. So the poem, the idea behind this poem, is perhaps unlikely on a panel depicting children. But when you look in detail, hang on, let's scroll back down again. Yes, when you look in detail at the way it's put together, this panel with the poem on is obviously damaged. The top is broken off. Is it even in its original location? The space above the little cage with the shroud figures is a complete blank on the other monuments. So many questions, so few answers. There it is as a nice little puzzle on a couple of family tombs in Tenby. So there we are. We have 3 cadaver tombs. We have these 2 shroud effigies. We can put them in the context of the art of the macabre in general. And again, there are very few surviving examples of that in Wales. There is this lovely Death and the Gallant, one of the wall paintings that have recently been discovered in the parish church of Cadaver in the Vale of Glamorgan. It's a death figure dragging a rather fashionably dressed young man. He's in the height of mid to late 15th century fashion. He's got a tight bum freezer jacket that's showing just about everything he's got. He's got power shoulders to die for. He would probably have long pointed toed shoes, but his feet have been lost. But he's not actually really elite. He's showing off, but he's got a Monmouth cap on his head. And the death figure in this painting really is quite gruesome. It's got worms crawling around it. This attached to its chest is probably a toad. So, you know, this really is quite gruesome. It's part of the Dance of Death tradition. There's another example of Death and the Gallant in the parish church of Newark in Nottinghamshire. I'm grateful to Sally Badham and to her husband Tim for this. This one, rather less dramatic. The Llancarvan one is dragging the young man against a certain amount of resistance. Here, they're just sort of looking at each other, and death seems to be tempting the young man, who again is very fashionably dressed. So it belongs in the same tradition as paintings of the Dance of Death. We won't be able to show the next couple of images when this goes on YouTube because I don't have copyright clearance to do that, but I have put links for them on that blog page. Here is an example of a fragment from the full Dance of Death at Tallinn. And you can see death figures dragging a cardinal, a king. Doesn't matter who you are, death will come for you, death will drag you into the dance. And it also belongs to the same macabre tradition as the story of the 3 living and the 3 dead, where you have 3 young men, or as in the poem at Tenby, an old man, a middle-aged man, and a young man. They've gone out hunting, and they're confronted by 3 rotting corpses. And the corpses say, "As we are, so you will be." And it's all part of this idea that you have to be reminded that death will come for you. You have to prepare for it. You can die a good death by preparing for it, or you can make a mess of it at the last minute, and you can just be dragged away, unprepared. So it is all part of a particular mindset. A couple of other examples of the macabre in Wales. Here are the web links, they're all on the blog. This little figure, like the St. Dogmael's cadaver tomb, very, very badly carved. It looks for all the world like a Halloween jack-o'-lantern. And this is a figure on one of the misericords at the former Dominican Priory in Brecon, which is now Christ College, Brecon. And if you're not familiar with misericords, they're a sort of hop-up seat that members of monastic communities, they were expected to get up in the night. There were quite long church services that they had to say in the middle of the night when there were a lot of them still half asleep. Standing through these was difficult, but you weren't supposed to sit down. So they have seats that tip up, and it's a bit like when you tip the cinema seat up and you can sort of perch yourself on the top of it as a ledge. These misericords have little ledges that you could sit on. And underneath the ledges, you get all sorts of carvings. They are often the kind of carvings that reflect the culture of the marginal in medieval illuminated manuscripts, where you get all kinds of bizarre images in the margins of quite serious manuscripts. Now, this death figure at the Dominican Priory in Brecon, I think is, again, quite significant, and partly because he is so crudely carved. The Dominicans were, of all the orders of friars, perhaps the most keen on using the imagery of the macabre, using the dance of death in their preaching, warning people in this very graphic way that they had to prepare for what was inevitably going to come for them. And a lot of the most spectacular dances of death, either that survive in Europe or that we know about from medieval Europe, are in Dominican friaries, at Basle, at Colmar, at Bern. The figure at Brecon is one of a set of different carvings. There's, I think this is meant to be an angel. I'm pretty sure this is meant to be a lion. This is either a horse or possibly a unicorn. And these strange, grotesque heads on the armrests of the misericords. And you can see the whole thing is very crudely carved, very badly put together. Again, it looks as though the Dominican friars of Brecon, they were aware of the fashion, if you like, for macabre carving. They were a small, badly funded institution. They didn't have the resources to commission a very professional product. These may, in fact, have been produced by a member of the community, or possibly by the local jobbing carpenter who could just about bash together something like that. So again, I think the crudity is part of the point. They wanted it, even though they couldn't afford the full professional product. And the other point about the death figure here, we look at him carefully. He's actually kneeling. Now, this is partly to fit the figure in under the ledge of the misericord, but it also reminds us that these death figures, they are not evil. They are not sent by the devil. The death figure at Llancarvan is not dragging the young man off to hell. He's dragging him into the churchyard. Death is actually one of the good guys. Death in the English play of Everyman is described as God's mighty messenger. Death in the Welsh play, the dialogue of the soul and the body, which is more or less the Welsh mystery play of the Last Judgment. The angel describes death as, well, he says, Cenadwr yw e, yr Iesu. He is Jesus's messenger. So we have to try to put aside an awful lot of the more recent thinking about death as something which is represented as hideous and evil. Death is there as an awful warning, but he is God's messenger. The other example of the macabre that I've come across from medieval Wales is the coat heel tester. Now, this is a little panel from it with this really quite aggressive death figure with a great dart. It's called the coat heel tester because that's where it's ended up, at Coat Hill in Devon, but it almost certainly came either from medieval Wales or from the Welsh borders. And this is just a part of a huge piece of wood carving, which is thought to have been part of a bed commissioned by the great Sir Rhys ap Thomas to commemorate a great tournament that he organised at his castle at Carew in Pembrokeshire, when he, on the first anniversary of his being raised to the Order of the Garter. However, a Welsh furniture historian has recently argued for a slightly later date and a provenance in the Welsh March, based on the detail of the tree ring patterns. The tree ring patterns give it a date of, well, they've said 1524 to 1550. I would think, given the fact that it also includes this very detailed panel of the 5 wounds of Christ and the instruments of the Passion, I don't think you'd have used that after the Pilgrimage of Grace. So I think we're looking at something from the 1520s. And the tree ring patterns also suggest that it may have come from just over the border into Herefordshire, but an area which was still quite strongly Welsh speaking in the early 16th century. So that's about it. So was I right in saying that the Welsh didn't really pay that much attention to the art of the macabre? What I then found is that we have a considerable, I don't want to call it a body of poetry, I don't want to call it a corpus of poetry. We've got a lot of medieval Welsh poetry and several examples of poetry on macabre themes. Now, it's often been said that medieval culture did in visual and material terms what post-Reformation culture did in visual terms, to which the Welsh replied, actually, we were doing stuff in visual terms. What was done elsewhere in the medieval period in visual terms, we in Wales did in words, we did in poetry, we were ahead of the game. The problem with this amazing resource of poetry is, of course, that it's in Welsh. And it's in medieval Welsh, which means I struggle with it. But fortunately, at the point when I was starting to feel that I was looking in the wrong place for evidence about Welsh patterns of commemoration, that I really ought to be doing more work on the poetry, a Welsh lecturer from our local further education college turned up saying, I'm interested in doing a PhD. I'd like to do something medieval. Can you suggest something? We said, oh yes, come and look at all this wonderful poetry and see what it says about death and commemoration, see if there is any poetry about the macabre. So he signed up and he did his PhD. It's an enormously useful resource because, bless his heart, although he wanted to write it up in Welsh, he agreed to write it in English so that it could get a wider readership. And he also squared up to translating a lot of the crucial poetry. Now, if you go to my university's research website, pure.southwales.act.uk, the URL for his thesis is ridiculously long and you'll never remember it. But if you Google for his name, David Hale, and you Google for death and commemoration, you will find it. And I've also put a link to it on a page on our blog. So he gave me some wonderful examples of Welsh poetry, the macabre. This one by Dafydd Hiradig, for example. I mean, Dafydd is one of our most important medieval poets. He was the author of the Gramadeg Pen Caer, which is a grammar of the basic rules for Welsh poetry. He died in 1371. I mean, look, you know, heb na chroen na chig, dremig, drumwedd, no skin nor flesh, the eyes full of maggots, the mouth is a sardonic black hole, the white teeth like old pegs, the dirty grey putrid bones. Wonderful stuff. And this is just a little bit of it. Oh, it goes on for pages and pages. But the odd thing about it, this is the only poem that he wrote in that genre. We think we've got his tomb in the parish church at Tremadchir. There is no macabre imagery on it. It's as though he'd come across it. I mean, he was obviously well-read, well-travelled. He'd come across the art of the macabre. He'd possibly come across some poetry of the macabre. He thought, you know what, I could do that. He's really gone for it whole hog. But then he's done it. He doesn't want to do it again. It's possible that he couldn't find a market for it because these poets, some of them really were the PR guys of their day. They wrote what their patrons wanted. They wrote what they could be paid for. And if he wasn't going to be paid for it, there was a limit to how much of it he was going to do. But still, you know, it does suggest there was an interest in the imagery of the macabre, but it possibly wasn't that widespread. We do have some more specific references to the dance of death in medieval Welsh poetry. And most of them, like a lot of the English references, they talk about it as the dance of Paul's, after the famous dance of death in the Pardon churchyard at Old St. Paul's, for which Lydgate wrote the poems. Now, this one by Lewis Glyn Coffey is clearly describing the actual London one. He says, in the chapel of Paul's, I saw a cruel dance to take a life by violence. And then he goes on to reflect on his own age, his own mortality, the general mortality of humanity. So he's using this as a peg on which to hang a meditation on mortality. Some of the poets talking about the Dance of Paws are clearly talking about something more general. Gwyttor Glyn, for example, uses it as a metaphor for the battlefield in the Wars of the Roses, in an elegy for William Herbert, first Earl of Pembroke, of the first Herbert congregation, who was killed at the Battle of Edgecote in 1469. Gwyttor Glyn likens the battlefield to a dance of paws, a dance of death, in its randomness, in the way that everyone, never mind their rank, is carried off. So the dance of death is used in various ways, but there are some poems where it seems to me that the poet has a specific local inspiration. This is Lewis Mone writing an elegy, the Welsh word is a marwnad, to Sir Thomas Salisbury of Llywelyn, who died in 1505. And Lewis Mone says, "Pa loes angau paws yngod, what agony the death of Paws nearby." And you have to imagine the performance element in this poetry. Quite a lot of it wasn't actually written down at the time. It was composed for oral performance, and an elegy would probably be performed at something like the funeral feast. So you imagine Lewis Mone, he's standing up, everybody's, had a meal, they've commemorated Sir Thomas. He is reciting this great poem to commemorate him, and he says the death of Paws nearby. Where is he pointing to? The Salisbury home was at Llywelyn, near Denbigh, in the Vale of Clwyd. So it could have been any of the local parish churches, but perhaps more likely one of the friary churches. There was a Carmelite friary in Denbigh, or possibly was it another Dominican friary? There was a Dominican friary at Llywelyn, just down the river. So you've got the possibility of a lost wall painting of the Dance of Death somewhere around the Denbigh area in the Vale of Clwyd. Another of Lewis Mone's elegies, this one to Sir John Gray. Here again, he is clearly describing a dance of death. The leader trailing after death's shoulder, the king's lineage all decaying. This is fairly standard stuff. This bit about the bird, diriad yw'r aderyn, doin si fyw ar dawns a ddyn. This image of a bird, an eagle possibly, leading the living into the dance, is very, very vivid, very visual. And it's not something that I've seen in any of the surviving versions of the Dance of Death. And I asked Sophie Easterback, and honestly, if Sophie hasn't seen it, it doesn't exist. And Sophie hasn't seen anything like it. So we are wondering whether, again, this is a specific wall painting of the Dance of Death with this specific visual image of a bird being involved. Probably one of the hawking birds leading the living into the dance. And Sir David Trevor, who was an Anglesey priest, this is where I got the title of the lecture from. Again, he's talking about death. I mean, this is where he talks about death as a cage of bones and gristle with a shanks and jaw of bogeyman. And he describes him leading all levels of humanity into the dance. The Pope, the Emperor, the barons, the king has been drinking his wine, but it won't help him. The baby being dragged out of its cradle. But here again, we've got a very vivid image of him dragging the Tanir ymherodr Tana, doin yr emperor o drorau dad, stealing the emperor from his father's tower. And this again is a very vivid image, it's a very visual image. And it's not something that any of us, Sophie or any of us, have seen anywhere else. So is this another lost wall painting of the Dance of Death? Did we have two or possibly even three of them in medieval Wales? We're completely lost, that we have no record of, except what we can read between the lines of these poems. There are other references to death in the poetry, which may come from visual sources. There's a reference to death playing dice. Now, the nearest I could get to this was this famous chess game on a wall painting in Sweden, death playing chess with a young man. This is what inspired Ingmar Bergman's film, The Seventh Seal. And Lewis Morgannwg, a Glamorgan poet, in an elegy for Sian Griffith, who was first wife of Sir William Herbert Colebrook, he says, "Chwarae ag angau nid gwyw," playing with death is worth nothing. It's like playing dice for him. He's always going to win. Now, this idea of death playing dice, again, it's not something we'd come across anywhere else. You do get death figures and figures playing dice. There's, well, the famous painting by Bruegel, The Triumph of Death, which is incredibly macabre and full of death figures and full of people who have failed to face up to the warning that death is going to come for them. And in one corner of that painting is a young man who's been gambling. He's been playing with dice and death's going to come for him, so he's lost. But it's not death who's playing with the dice. It's the young man, and it's presented as something which is foolish and perhaps even evil. Dice also crop up in the imagery of the crucifixion. One of the elements of the full set of the instruments of the Passion is the little pot of dice that the soldiers are using to gamble for Christ's seamless robe. So there again, the dice are presented as something which is somehow wrong. Here, it's either death or God who is playing dice. It's someone who is on the side of good, but at the same time, you don't play with them because they're always going to win. And the other game, which it would seem death is always going to win, this is Lewis Morgannwg again, in an elegy for Sir Richard Herbert of Montgomery. And this time, the game that's being played is a game, it's a ball game. Chwarae'r bell, my gelyn, the enemy plays the ball day and night for the lifetime of a man. Again, the idea that there's absolutely no point in playing against death because death is always going to win. What ball game was death playing, you wonder? I mean, my first instinct was that it was a Welsh game called Knapan, which is the Welsh equivalent of free-form football. The only rule of Knapan is that there are no rules. It's still played in Cardiff, in Queen Street in Cardiff on the International Day. Don't go anywhere near the ball. Honestly, you don't want to be near the ball. It's a riot. So was death playing Knapan? Was death playing tennis? This is early 16th century writing. By later 16th century, you've got quite a few references in English and European literature to death playing tennis, to human souls being like the ball in the game and they're being batted around. Maybe. Or, going back to the Llancarver, Death and the Gallant, death is dragging the young man out into the churchyard. The ball game that was played in churchyards was fives. Again, you bounced the ball up against the wall. And quite a lot of churches, you will find markers on the north wall of the church, and sometimes shutters, so that the church windows could be protected while the fives game was being played. So possibly, death is dragging you out into the churchyard to make you play a game of fives in which you know he will win. So, whether these two poems about death playing dice and death playing ball were actually inspired by visual representations is perhaps less likely. I mean, I am getting more and more confident about the Dance of Death being, that the Dance of Death was there, and that was what inspired the poetry. I'm not so convinced about these two. But nevertheless, they are part of a Welsh tradition of poetry of the macabre. Warning poetry, you're not going to win against death. Warning poetry, death takes everybody. You have to prepare, because it's by being prepared that you can die a good death. So there may have been more of the visual imagery of the macabre in medieval Wales than I at first thought. There's also the fact that the poetry does, in some cases, do what visual imagery did elsewhere. But the poetry also suggests that there might have been a lot more visual imagery that we've lost. Now, if you want more background on all of what I've been talking about, as I say, I've put a page in our blog. It's got the link to David Hale's thesis, which is a remarkable compendium of material on death and commemoration. He's translated all the key poetry. He's translated the full poem in a lot of cases. And David and I have also written an article on these poems about death playing dice, death playing ball, the possibility of Welsh versions of the Dance of Death, which again, we've been able to put online. So there's a link to that. And David has an article in the Current Church Monuments. Mark was earlier showing you the journal. David has an article in the Current Church Monuments talking about what we can learn from the poetry about burial and funeral customs in Wales, which again is quite enlightening. And for me, I think the really exciting thing is that it's opening up this resource of Welsh poetry, which now that it's in translation, we can offer to a wider readership. So thank you very much for your time, and do follow it up if you can.